Welcome in. I'm Hunter Kanoki, and this is Fool's FAQ, a show where I take the internet's most burning questions and give you an answer that'll make you the smartest person at your next conference call. On today's episode, dialing up the drama. If you've ever picked up a phone, you've probably heard the name Alexander Graham Bell. The story goes something like this. Brilliant Scottish inventor, working away in his Boston laboratory in 1876. Suddenly, he has a eureka moment and invents a telephone. Then he speaks those famous words into his contraption, quote, "Mr. Watson, come here, I want to see you," unquote, and boom, the world is changed by the genius of one man. It's a neat, tidy story that fits perfectly on a history test. Bell gets the credit, gets the patent, gets the glory, and eventually his company becomes a telecommunications giant AT&T. So, case closed, right? Well, not exactly. Because here's the thing about invention stories that sound too neat and tidy. They usually are. The real story of the telephone is messier, more controversial, and involves way more people than just good old Alexander Graham Bell. We're talking about a tale that includes Italian inventors, German physicists, patent office corruption, accusations of fraud, and enough legal drama to fill a courtroom thriller. So, did Alexander Graham Bell really invent the telephone? Well, the answer might surprise you. So, let's start by rewinding the clock a bit. The year is 1876, and the race to invent a practical telephone is heating up. But contrary to popular belief, Bell wasn't working in isolation. In fact, several inventors across different countries were all chasing the same dream of transmitting human speech over electrical wires. The most dramatic part of the story happens on February 14th, 1876, Valentine's Day, which seems fitting for a tale this tangled. On this single day, not one, but two men filed patent applications for telephone devices at the U.S. Patent Office. Alexander Graham Bell's attorney filed his application for, quote, improvements in telegraphy, unquote, in the morning. Just hours later, we're talking hours here, Elisha Gray filed what's called a patent caveat for his own telephone design. Now, a patent caveat wasn't quite a full patent application, but rather a notice saying, hey, I'm working on this thing and I intend to file a proper patent within 3 months. Think of it as calling dibs on an invention. But here's where it gets interesting. Bell's patent was granted on March 7th, 1876, making him patent number 174,465. 3 days later, on March 10th, Bell achieved his first successful telephone transmission with those famous words to his assistant Thomas Watson. But here's the kicker. The method Bell used for that successful call wasn't even described in his original patent. He used what's called a liquid transmitter, a technique that was described in Elisha Gray's caveat. Suspicious? Well, many people thought so. This led to what became perhaps the most litigated question in U.S. history, around 600 lawsuits challenging Bell's patent rights. But Bell won every single one. Now, if Bell and Gray were the only players in the game, we might chalk it up to an unfortunate coincidence of timing. But the telephone's origin story gets much more complicated when we start looking at the other inventors who were working on the similar devices years, even decades, before Bell's famous patent. So, let's meet Antonio Meucci, an Italian immigrant living on Staten Island, New York. Now, Meucci had been experimenting with voice transmission devices since 1849, a full 27 years before Bell's patent. He even had a working system installed in his own house so that he could talk to his wife, who was bedridden upstairs. Meucci called his device the telefono. By 1871, he had filed a patent caveat for it with the U.S. Patent Office. But here's where Meucci's story gets tragic. He was poor. He didn't speak English well and couldn't afford the $10 fee to renew his patent caveat after 1874. And some reports even suggest that laboratory models of his device were lost or disposed of by the American District Telegraph Company. In 2002, the U.S. House of Representatives actually passed a resolution acknowledging Meucci's contributions to the invention of the telephone, stating that if he had been able to maintain his patent caveat, quote, no patent could have been issued to Bell, unquote. Of course, this resolution came 126 years too late to do Meucci any good. But wait, there's more. Let's travel back even further and meet Johann Philipp Reis, a German physics teacher who was demonstrating voice transmission devices as early as 1861. Reis built what he called a telephone. In fact, he's actually the one credited with coining the term. His device could transmit musical tones and even some speech, though the quality wasn't great. Now, to prove his device worked, Reis used the German phrase, quote, the horse does not eat cucumber salad, unquote, because it was particularly hard to understand acoustically. While his device wasn't perfect, it was definitely transmitting voice electronically, 15 years before Bell's patent. Even earlier than that, we also have Vincenzo Manzetti, an Italian inventor who conceived of a speaking telegraph as early as 1844. Now, while Manzetti didn't build a working device until the 1860s, his early conceptualization of electrical voice transmission predates Bell's work by over 30 years. So, just to recap, we've got Manzetti thinking about it in 1844, Bucci demonstrating it in 1849, 5 years later, Rice perfecting it in 1861, 12 years after that, and then Bell patenting it in 1876. Seeing a pattern here? Now, let's get back to that suspicious timing on Valentine's Day, 1876. Remember how Bell and Gray filed their applications just hours apart? Well, some historians argue that this wasn't just an amazing coincidence. Enter Zenas Wilbur, a patent examiner for the U.S. Patent Office, who was allegedly an alcoholic with money problems. In 1886, 10 years after the fact, Wilbur signed an affidavit claiming that Bell had bribed him with $100 to look at Gray's patent caveat before finalizing his own application. Now, according to Wilbur's confession, this allowed Bell to add crucial details to his patent, specifically the principle of variable resistance, which appeared to be scribbled in the margin of Bell's application as if added at the last minute. Wilbur's affidavit then stated, quote, "This affidavit shows that the Bell telephone patent was obtained by direct fraud and corruption of a government official, and that the direct agent was the patentee himself," unquote. But here's the thing about deathbed confessions from somebody like Wilbur, who was a broke alcoholic. It's not exactly the most reliable evidence. Bell's supporters dismiss Wilbur's claims, and the courts continue to uphold Bell's patents. Still, the allegations added another layer of controversy to an already murky story. Modern researchers have found additional evidence that raises questions about Bell's role. In Bell's own laboratory notebooks, there's a sketch of a liquid transmitter that looks remarkably similar to diagrams in Gray's patent caveat, sketches that Bell drew just days after returning from Washington, where he had met with patent lawyers and examiners. Author Seth Schulman, in his book The Telephone Gambit, argues that this visual evidence is pretty conclusive. The timing is suspicious. Bell draws a diagram that's nearly identical to Gray's secret filing right after a trip to the patent office, and then uses this exact method to achieve his first successful telephone call. And what makes this even more intriguing is Bell's behavior afterward. Despite becoming incredibly wealthy from the telephone patents, Bell always seemed uncomfortable taking credit for the invention. He gave away almost all of his shares in the Bell Telephone Company to his wife and swore to never work in telephony again. He always said he was more proud of his work helping deaf children than of inventing the telephone. Could this be the behavior of a man carrying a guilty secret? So, where does that leave us? Did Alexander Graham Bell really invent the telephone? Well, the answer is both yes and no. Depends on how you define invent. If we mean who was the first person to transmit human speech electrically over wires, then that honor probably belongs to Antonio Meucci or perhaps Johann Philipp Reis, who even coined the term telephone. If we mean who first conceived of a speaking telegraph, then Vincenzo Manzetti takes a crown. But if we mean who created the first commercially viable telephone system and successfully patented it, then yes, that was Alexander Graham Bell. Bell didn't just build a device that worked once in a laboratory. He created a system that could be manufactured, installed, and used by ordinary people. Bell was also incredibly savvy about the business side of invention. He had financial backing from influential people like Gardner Hubbard, who understood how to navigate the patent system and build a company. The other inventors, brilliant as they were, either lacked the resources, the business acumen, or simply the timing to turn their inventions into world-changing enterprises. The real story of the telephone isn't about one brilliant man having a eureka moment. It's about multiple inventors working across different countries and decades, each contributing pieces to a puzzle that eventually became the modern telephone. Manzetti had the concept, Bucci had the working model, Rice had the transmission technology, Gray had the liquid transmitter idea, and Bell had the patent, the business plan, and the right connections. In many ways, Bell was like Steve Jobs. He didn't necessarily invent the technology, but he knew how to refine it, market it, and turn it into something that changed the world. The difference is that we generally acknowledge that the iPhone built on decades of previous innovations in computing, touchscreens, and mobile technology. With the telephone, we've created this myth of solitary genius that doesn't match the historical reality. The controversy over Bell's patent led to the creation of one of the most powerful corporations in history, AT&T, who dominated America telecommunications for over a century until it was broken up by antitrust action in the 1980s. All of that power and wealth flowed from a patent that may have been obtained through fraud or at a minimum built heavily on the work of others who never received proper credit. So you can argue that the patent issued to Bell is the most valuable patent in history. So the next time someone asks you who invented the telephone, you can tell them it's complicated. Alexander Graham Bell certainly deserves credit for creating the first practical, commercially successful telephone system. But the technology itself? Well, that was a collaborative effort spanning decades and continents involving brilliant minds who deserve to be remembered alongside Bell in history books. The telephone wasn't invented by one man in one moment. It was invented by humanity, one breakthrough at a time. And that's a much more interesting story than the myth we usually tell. Thank you so much for listening to Fool's FAQ. Feel free to leave a 5-star rating wherever you get your podcasts, as it also helps new listeners discover the show. For more fascinating answers to your burning questions, subscribe wherever you get your podcasts, and always stay curious.